So mobile, tablets, handhelds as well, all these different devices are around where people can play games. And as a gamer, that's awesome, right? We can play games 24/7. As games makers, that's awesome too, because we get to think about not just one particular place where people play games or get invested in our worlds, but multiple touch points for them.
Nowadays, people want to play games anywhere, at any time. While making board games that travel with us is a relatively simple endeavor, making electronic and digital games that can fit in our pockets has been something of a different story.
Look at Football 2's quarterback. Ever seen a better scrambler? A better passer? That's a Bradshaw in there.
The first generation of handheld games begins in 1976, with the first consumer-released all-electric game by Mattel Electronics. Mattel Auto Race was designed by Mark Close and programmer Mark Lesser, who used repurposed calculator hardware to create a simple racing game. A red LED, or light-emitting diode, signified the player's car, whose goal was to get from the bottom of the screen, which was nothing more than an LED board, to the top of the screen in 99 seconds or less. The game ran on one 9-volt battery and was only 511 bytes of code. Auto race sales were soon eclipsed by the introduction of Mattel Electronics' massively popular Football and Football 2 in 1977 and 1978. One of the earliest handheld gaming devices was the Microvision from Milton Bradley, released in 1979. Although only 12 games were ever made for this handheld, it was the first that allowed players to swap out cartridges. Unlike Auto Racer, Microvision used a 16x16 LCD. Each Microvision had a 12-button rubber key matrix. In theory, this meant that each game would have different keypad configurations. The keypads could easily be damaged, and once that happened, the games were usually rendered unusable. Nintendo entered the handheld gaming market in 1980 with its Game & Watch series.
The Game & Watch was the invention of Gunpei Yokoi, who is one of Nintendo's major innovators, inventors. He invented a lot of Nintendo toys, and he invented a lot of its early electronic stuff.
Each Game & Watch provided players with a single game experience in 2 difficulty modes, using a fixed printed LCD screen, which also displayed the time. Some units came with added alarm clock functionality. Every Game & Watch ran on button cell batteries. In 1982, Nintendo would introduce multi-screen functionality with the game Oil Panic. In June of that same year, Donkey Kong became the first game to be released with dual screens and a directional keypad, or D-pad, also invented by Yokoi and made popular on the NES controller. The D-pad helped eliminate the need for bulky hardware, helping to make these games truly portable. The flip case design would later help inspire the 2004 Nintendo DS. The Game & Watch paved the way for the introduction of similar standalone handhelds by Tiger Electronics in the late 1980s. Tiger produced a number of standalone handhelds based on popular licensed video games, TV shows, and movies.
You say you want to be a street fighter. You're no street fighter. Not until you've mastered the 6 world warriors of the Street Fighter II handheld game. 100 hand slaps and rolling attacks, fireballs and hurricane kicks are your weapons. Street Fighter II handheld game, new from Tiger.
What most people today consider handheld gaming systems began in 1989 with the introduction of the Game Boy by Nintendo. Designed by Gunpei Yokoi, Satoru Okada, and Nintendo Research and Development 1, Game Boy entered the United States market around $100 and was bundled with Tetris, a move that would prove to have enormous success.
When I was negotiating with Nintendo, this is before I went to the Soviet Union, I said to Mr. Arakawa, Mr. Arakawa, you should include this Tetris in every Game Boy that you sell, because it was their policy always to include one game with the hardware, whatever hardware they sold. And I said, well, I've got Mario. Why should I license Tetris from you? I can just do Mario. I said, okay. If you want Game Boy to be bought and played by boys, include Mario. But if you include Tetris, everyone will play Game Boy.
Tetris became the game that everyone wanted, and Game Boy was what everyone wanted to play it on. It went on to sell 1 million units in the US within the first week. The Game Boy had a 2.6-inch screen that boasted a resolution of 160 by 144.
The original Game Boy had a black and white screen, and so if you take a normal Nintendo game and move it to that little tiny screen, then if you have, for example, bullets in the air, those bullets are so small it's like 1 or 2 dots.
The now famous olive green color was used to offset the indigo color of the LCD screen. What sets the Game Boy apart from its competitors was not that it was necessarily better technically. It was the sheer number of games players had to choose from. Some 716 titles in all. The release of the Game Boy also saw the release of the first generation Game Link cable, which helped to revolutionize multiplayer gaming on the go. The Game Boy wasn't without its technical issues. The LCD screen often made images blurry, and the lack of backlight made it difficult to use the Game Boy in direct or low light. Game Boy helped cement Nintendo's place in the video game market, handheld and otherwise. It remains one of the most popular handhelds ever released and helped introduce entirely new audiences to video games. Often overshadowed by the release of the Game Boy was Atari's solution to handheld gaming, the Lynx, also released in 1989. The Lynx had an impressive backlit 4096 color screen, could link up to 17 devices at once, had reversible controls, and offered 64K RAM of memory. The Lynx used a 6502 chip, the same used in the Apple II and Commodore 64. The chip helped the Lynx become the first portable system that could zoom and distort sprites for a pseudo 3D effect.
In over 4,000 colors, with full stereo sound, on the largest portable video game screen in the world.
Its technical superiority, however, came at a price. The Lynx was introduced at $199, making it much more expensive than the Game Boy. Supply issues and lack of games helped seal the Lynx's fate. It was eventually taken off the market in 1994. Sega entered the North American handheld market in 1991 with Sega Game Gear, priced at $149.99. The Game Gear was marketed to consumers as a more mature adult version of the Game Boy.
If you were colorblind and had an IQ less than 12, then you wouldn't care which portable you had. Of course, you wouldn't care if you drank from the toilet either. Game Gear.
The Game Gear was based off the architecture of Sega's Master System and used the same 8-bit Zilog Z80A processor, clocked at 3.5 MHz. It was able to display 4,096 colors, far more than the color palette available on the Master System. The shape and controls of the Game Gear closely resembled the Sega Genesis, and it was considerably more comfortable to hold than the Game Boy. Despite including popular titles like Sonic the Hedgehog and technical superiority, it simply could not compete with the Game Boy. Ultimately, a short battery life of 3 to 5 hours, combined with a low quantity of new and original titles, prevented the new Game Gear from achieving significant consumer adoption. Though the Game Gear was the Game Boy's closest competition, it only sold 11 million units in its lifetime. The Game Boy sold 10 times that number. Sega tried to capitalize on the success of the Sega Genesis, known as Mega Drive in other regions, by releasing a handheld version of the console in 1995, known as the Sega Nomad. The handheld could function as a standalone home system and had a port at the bottom of the console to support 2-player gamers. Despite improvements in screen resolution and other technical advancements, the high cost, bulky design, and horrid battery life of less than an hour made it a less than desirable choice for consumers. The mid-90s represented some leaner years for handheld gaming, and Nintendo saw no need to speed up development for another Game Boy, with sales of the original still so strong. In 1996, mobile gaming received a boost with the release of the Tamagotchi by the Japanese toy company Bandai, which sold a total of 76 million units worldwide. Bandai would try its hand at handheld games again in a more concerted effort in 1999 with the Wonder Swan, which was never released outside of Japan. By the time of the release of the Wonder Swan, the Game Boy Color had been released, with Nintendo reasserting its dominance in the handheld gaming market. The Game Boy Color, while providing 4 times as much memory over the original Game Boy, was considered more of a stopgap measure for Nintendo as they continued their development of the Game Boy Advance. The real benefit of the Game Boy Color was that it was backwards compatible with the complete collection of Game Boy games, something that no handheld had successfully done before. Game Boy Color achieved this by maintaining the same screen resolution as the original Game Boy, 160 by 144 pixels. The GBC included the ability to wirelessly connect to other players. In 1997, Tiger Electronics, who had success in the late 80s and early 90s with their single-game LCD handhelds, introduced the Gamecom. Tiger's Gamecom was the first portable gaming device to use a touchscreen and online capabilities. The touchscreen proved difficult to use, and the internet only allowed for text-based browsing. The Gamecom also required users to purchase separate peripherals in order to access the internet. Neo Geo sold the most powerful and advanced console on the market. It was as close to an arcade experience that any home player could hope for. Neo Geo would finally enter the handheld market in 1998. Intended as a competitor to the Game Boy, the Neo Geo Pocket SNK was limited to a 16-bit grayscale screen. However, this was not the only challenge the device faced. A week before Neo Geo debuted in Japan, Nintendo released the Game Boy Color. Neo Geo quickly followed up with the Neo Geo Pocket Color, though it didn't reach US retail stores until 2000. The NG-PC had 3 times the RAM of the Game Boy Color and a 16-bit processor. It also included SNK's answer to the D-pad, the clicky stick. The clicky stick helped create better fighting game experiences for gamers like SNK vs. Capcom, Card Fighters Clash. But the Neo Geo devices suffered from a lack of third-party development. They couldn't compete with the widespread availability of the Game Boy Color, especially with the release of extremely popular games such as the Pokemon franchise.
Look who's back. And this time, the 2 of you are partners in the latest installment of the Pokemon saga. It's Pokemon Yellow, the special Pikachu edition for Game Boy Color, where it's you and Pikachu catching as many as you can together. Look for the Pokemon Yellow Bundle Pack. It includes a limited edition Pokemon Game Boy and Yellow Game.
The Game Boy Advance, or GBA, was released in 2001 for around $150 and introduced an entirely new system from Nintendo for the first time in over a decade. The largest improvement to the GBA proved to be the screen, which used a thin film transistor liquid crystal display, or TFT LCD. The screen helped prevent the all-too-common blurring that had haunted previous handhelds. The GBA used a 16.8 MHz 32-bit chipset, vastly improving on the processing speeds of previous Game Boys. The GBA also included shoulder buttons and basic 3D modeling, but failed to solve the issue of backlighting, requiring users to play in the presence of an external light source. This wasn't enough to stop it from selling over 80 million units worldwide, however, and cemented 12 years of Nintendo domination in the handheld market. In 2004, Nintendo Dual Screen, or DS, launched onto the market. The dual TFT LCD screens worked in tandem, with the lower screen also having touchscreen capabilities to allow players to control in-game elements in a variety of ways. The DS also featured wireless networking, which allowed up to 16 players to play simultaneously. The players could also talk to one another over the DS's voice recognition system. The DS wasn't an immediate success within the gaming community, with many viewing it as bulky and awkwardly shaped. Nintendo was able to overcome gamers' initial hesitation by releasing popular games such as Mario Kart and continuing to update DS models for a more compact and comfortable experience. The DS has sold over 130 million units worldwide. Also in 2004 came the release of Sony's PlayStation Portable, though the PSP didn't reach North American shores until 2005. The 32-bit PSP blew the DS out of the water technologically. The handheld had a clock speed of 333 MHz, compared to the 67 MHz of the DS. The processing power of the PSP nearly matched that of the PlayStation 2 home consoles. It also had the largest screen size of any handheld device on the market at 480 by 272 pixels. The PSP was the first truly multimedia device, allowing users to play music, go on the internet, and watch feature-length films. This was thanks in part to its use of an optical-based Universal Media Disc, or UMD, which took the place of cartridges and offered increased storage for game developers. The UMD was, however, slow, and the PSP was notorious for long loading times for its games. At a cost of some $249, the PSP's price was slightly off-putting to consumers, as was its shape and weight. While the PSP never outsold Nintendo's handheld offerings, it did represent a market success for Sony. In 2009, Sony introduced the PSP Go. The unit was well ahead of its time. However, as a result of slow adoption and pushback from retailers against the digital-only purchase experience, the PSP Go was discontinued in 2011. That same year, Nintendo and Sony both released new handheld devices: the Nintendo 3DS and the Sony PlayStation Vita. The 3DS aimed to deliver a 3D experience without the need for using 3D glasses. At a time when 3D was hyping up in home television markets, the move generated a lot of consumer interest, but struggled to obtain widespread developer support. The Vita contained a quad-core processor, motion-based gaming support with accelerometers, and a touchscreen interface. The Vita is capable of delivering PlayStation 3 quality experiences in a compact and portable device. Today, the DS system continues to be an extremely profitable line for Nintendo, and with ongoing improvements in the interaction between the PlayStation home consoles for remote gameplay and second screen interactions, the Vita has also seen steady sales. However, ongoing improvements and innovations to dedicated handheld gaming devices has been slowing down since 2010 for one significant reason and one reason only: the rise of the smartphone.
We've had a shift away from casual gameplay on dedicated game consoles, and that shift has materialized on mobile and tablet. The handheld business is significantly smaller today than it was just 5 years ago, because anything that you would have paid $20 or $30 or $40 for 5 years ago, you can get for free now.